We are in the middle of a series where we've been exploring the new normal from the book of 1 Thessalonians, a letter Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica 2,000 years ago. And really what we're trying to do is look at, in this horrible season of COVID, where there's so much that is bad and going wrong, what is it that we can celebrate? We want to ask ourselves questions like, what has actually been worthwhile that we've accumulated or picked up in this season? Or what should we keep out of the things that we've started doing since this whole thing started? Or what should we build into our future selves that has started to grow in us now? And so the first week we looked at thankfulness, and last week Joel talked about honor. And then this week I'm going to be talking about sacrifice. Sacrifice, because so much of our new behavior, I think, has been about putting other people in front of ourselves, of perhaps putting aside our own comfort and our own preferences about doing things in preference of other people. I don't know whether you think right back to the beginning of the coronavirus thing, when the NHS put out a thing. They wanted what they called volunteer responders. And they thought they might get, I think, 50,000 people from across the country who could help out the NHS and do non-medical things like delivering prescriptions and things like that. But what they actually got was 750,000 people sign up to do this thing in 4 days. So I just wonder whether in our crisis that we're in now, whether our eyes and our hearts and our minds are actually starting to look outside of ourselves and towards what's going on with other people. Let's have the first picture. Yes. Does anybody know who this is? Apparently, so I don't know anything about football, just to say that from the beginning, right? But I've heard of him because he's Marcus Rashford, who this week they've decided that he's going to get an MBE, so a medal from the Queen. And the reason is because even though he's, a multi-millionaire, 22-year-old footballer, he actually sacrificed that. He put aside his own preferences and put his head above the parapet to advocate for the most vulnerable in our society, for vulnerable children. And so the Queen is going to give him an MBE, a medal, to say, well done, you've sacrificed well, you've done a brilliant thing. And what a top guy. I gather he plays for Manchester United. So somebody told me that they're rubbish and they're going to be relegated this year. I don't know whether that's true. But yeah, so that Marcus Rashford, millionaire footballer, puts aside his own preferences and sticks his head above the parapet. Right, let's have the next picture. Someone who's perhaps less known to us is a guy called Jeff Norris. He's not getting an MBE, he's getting a B, what's it called? A BEM. That's like an MBE, only in a different order. See what I did there? A little joke. And he's not famous or rich. He doesn't have an audience of millions hanging on his Twitter feed or anything like that. Jeff Norris is a guy who works for Asda. He's a delivery driver for Asda. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when you couldn't get a delivery for love nor money, all the delivery slots went and the supermarket shelves were really bare. He decided that wasn't good enough. And so what he did is he gathered as many of his mates as he could, delivery drivers. And he came, after his shift finished on a Saturday, he came back on a Sunday and he collected all the stuff that people needed, people who were vulnerable, shielding or elderly, who really needed those deliveries. And he came back in and he delivered the stuff with his own car. And a bunch of other people did too. And so they've given him a British Empire medal. He's not famous or wealthy, but he played his part. He put aside his own day off, his own time in order to help other people. And for all of us, to a greater or lesser extent, we have got used to sacrificing for the benefit of others. We wear masks, don't we? Which is much more about protecting other people than it is about protecting ourselves. There's something in that, isn't there? I mean, I actually had a curry last night, and so I'm actually sort of vaguely asphyxiating myself every time I put the mask on. But I'm also protecting the people around me. That's the point. We are all doing things like we're not seeing our loved ones who we would love to spend time with because we know that we need to protect other people. We're cancelling birthday parties and graduations and weddings and all of those kind of things. We're putting other people before ourselves. And it strikes me about all of this sacrifice that is new in this season that we're living in at the moment, that it isn't just a nice way to live. It's actually the Jesus way to live. This is what Jesus talked about. Just one example from Luke chapter 10. He's talking about with an expert in God. And I always worry about when the Bible talks about experts in God because they don't tend to come off very well. But anyway, he's talking to this guy about what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. And the guy asks him, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus tells this parable that you've probably heard about the Good Samaritan, which is some robbers set about this guy when he's walking down the road one day, and they beat him up and they take all of his stuff. And another religious guy, a priest, walks past without doing anything. And then a Samaritan who's somebody from his crew, not a Samaritan, a Levite, somebody from his crew, walks past, does nothing about it. And it's the Samaritan, the guy from the other side, the other team, if you like, the guy who's hated, who has no reason at all in normal life to help him out, who helps him out, who sacrifices his time and his money and his comfort. And then Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." So challenging. And like so many things about Jesus, he doesn't just tell other people to do it. He does it himself. So ultimately, Jesus sacrifices himself. He dies on the cross for us. He puts other people first. He's sacrificed for our benefit. And like the Good Samaritan, we're the man in the story who gets beaten up. And Jesus is the Samaritan. He's the stranger with no compulsion other than love for his neighbor, who sacrifices himself to rescue us. I don't know whether you can relate to that. A few weeks ago here, I was telling a bit of my story. And when I would say that Jesus rescued me, the morning that I recognized who Jesus was and allowed myself to be rescued by him, I couldn't have been more of a stranger to God. I thought that Christians were nuts, actually. And yet, Jesus was like that Samaritan, loving me even when I didn't recognize or deserve it. And so the early church, which is where we come back to Thessalonians, the early church really understood this stuff and they lived it out. And so the letter in Paul's letters to the Thessalonians written by Paul, Paul was a Jew. He was from a really devout family. It says he was a Pharisee from a family of Pharisees. And he certainly wasn't, in his previous life, a fan of anyone who wasn't pure and holy and Jewish until he met Jesus. And then everything changed. And he traveled all over, bringing Jesus to the Gentiles, to the people who weren't part of his team. He was planting churches with them and for them. He was risking his life for them. He was shipwrecked 3 times. I mean, goodness, if I'd been shipwrecked once, I think I'd probably struggle to get back on a boat. If I did it twice, I'd probably assume that God was telling me not to get back on a boat again. But he did it 3 times. He was shipwrecked 3 times. He was beaten for this stuff. He was imprisoned for them. He put himself in harm's way time and time again for these Gentiles, for the people from the other side He sacrificed his own comfort and everything that he probably thought that he was going to do when he was growing up in order to love these people so well. So we're going to read from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, just a few verses. And it's going to come up on the screen. It says, "You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you." Doesn't it feel like Paul and his crew sat down and said, imagine what would happen if we all sacrificed, if we laid everything down, if we laid down all the things that we'd lived for up to this point, all the wealth that we've accumulated, our careers, our safety, our security, to live for the benefit of others and for Jesus. And for all the bad stuff that happened to Paul, do you think that his life was smaller for it? No. It was bigger, not smaller. It was richer, wider, deeper. We're still talking about the adventures of Paul and his friends 2,000 years later. Because they sacrificed, whole churches sprang into existence which didn't exist before. Whole new countries and regions came alive to the gospel. It says in verse 9, they toiled. These guys, they put in a shift. It was hard and it was risky and it was contested. But they made their sacrifices. And God did the rest. You know, across Swindon, there are brilliant Christians already doing this stuff. One of my mates, Simon, he looked at one of the estates in Swindon that other people would say has got issues. And he looked at it with God's eyes, with God's compassion. And he moved there 25 years ago. And he's still going, Simon, advocating for young people and the vulnerable, bridging the gaps between the authorities and the community, being church in that place, praying, making a difference. And it's not an easy life. And it's a sacrifice. But he's putting in a shift. He's doing the work. I think about Becky, who set up the night shelter for homeless people in our town 10 years ago, who was part of the street pastors walking around the town on a Saturday night and noticed that Swindon had a homelessness problem. And so she started up this night shelter in St Mary's, Robborncini, and so that's been running for over 10 years. And last year she was interviewed for the newspaper and she said this: I think if I'd known how big this would end up being, we would have been a bit scared. But it's been great to keep growing and keep meeting the needs of every person through our doors with the resources we have. So Becky made that sacrifice. She put in a shift. But what an adventure she's been able to live as a result. There's a part for all of us to play in this. If we turn that dial just a little bit of our own comfort, our own well-being, our security, the things that we've toiled for, we just turn up the sacrifice a bit, it's going to be a riot. And it takes sacrifice. But when we sacrifice, God does the rest. We often think that great life is to be found in comfort and in being served, but it's actually found in sacrifice. We often say things like, I love Jesus, he gives me peace, he gives me comfort, he gives me love. And that's not true, not wrong, it's true, it's actually beautiful. That is what Jesus is like. But we can get so much for Jesus. But he's inviting us deeper. And it's in the giving and it's in the sacrifice where we get to know Jesus better along the way. So I wonder, what is it that God is calling you to lay down this week? How's he inviting you to follow him this week? I'd like us to think about this a couple of ways. Firstly, personal, and then as a church congregation, as a church, Pattern Church. So personally, what would it look like for each of us to make sacrifices for our neighbours? Maybe even starting with the people that live either side of us, but thinking broader, our neighbours. What would it look like for us to lay down our lives in a radical way like Paul and his mates did? Or to set aside our hopes and our dreams, maybe to make sacrifices for our spouses or our families or our children in a new way? What would it look like to sacrifice for the 200,000 people who live in our town who don't yet have any relationship with Jesus? What would that look like? And then as we think about how we can respond to this as Pattern Church, it seems to us that with the impact of coronavirus, that we've got a rocky road ahead as a town. And that there's going to be more need and more people who need help and more people who need Jesus across the town. And so I'm sure you've heard of the Love Your Neighbour campaign that started in Holy Trinity Brompton in London, a church up there, and then spread out across the country, across all denominations and that kind of thing. And we have worked with Love Your Neighbour in the school holidays. Many of us were involved in putting together food parcels and delivering those to people who needed a bit of extra over the summer holidays. Well, Love Your Neighbour have actually just announced a huge partnership with the government, with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, who've given them some money, and to deliver three things. So to deliver food to those people who need it, to deliver debt advice to those who are stuck in debt, and to deliver employability help for the unemployed. And so we're actually going to join in with this. We're going to a bit of a big announcement. There should be a sort of fanfare or something. But we're going to keep doing the food parcels over the school holidays and possibly in between as well. If you would like to be involved in that project, then contact us at the church office, hello@patternchurch.org. We're also going to be setting up a debt advice centre because there are going to be huge numbers of people in our town that are struggling with that issue. And so we're going to be partnering with an organisation called Crosslight and training up people that we know from within the congregation and so on to really counsel people with that stuff. There's a lot of training and it's a regulated activity, so we really need Crosslight's help with that. But if that's something you would like to be involved in, then again, please let us know it in the church office. And then lastly, employability help for the unemployed. We're going to be partnering with an organisation called Starting Point, who are based in Reading, and they're looking to spread out again across the country, really mentoring young people who aren't in education or employment. And so if that's something that you would like to be involved in as well, then we're going to be starting that up before Christmas. So food, debt advice, employability skills, if you would like to be involved in that stuff, how about we as a church put our own comfort aside and really live for the benefit of other people who are struggling in our town? So, something for us all to be getting involved in. If you're a visitor here and you're thinking, I've never been to church before, and they're asking me to do loads of stuff. I want you to know that if you do none of this stuff, God loves you so much. But this is one way in which we can serve God and serve our town. It's part of our vision here at Pattern Church, inviting people into family to serve Swindon. And so this is that. This is the serving Swindon piece that we feel that we are called to do. And involved in that, how about if we take the things that we've learned over lockdown to live for the benefit of other people, and we live them out in our day-to-day lives?